You have already told a dream before the right time. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That project that was still in formation, that direction you had just begun to feel, that promise that had arrived so clearly and so internally that it seemed impossible not to share. And you told it to someone close, to a family member, to a trusted friend, and something happened after that which you could never quite explain. The energy vanished. The impetus disappeared. What seemed inevitable became improbable. The dream did not die from a single blow. It withered slowly until you stopped talking about it, and eventually you stopped believing it was real. You blamed the person with whom you shared it, or you blamed yourself for not having persisted. But neither of these is the complete explanation. What happened has a theological name, a documented psychological basis, and a concrete solution that will change the way you protect what is being formed within you from today forward. In the next few minutes, I will show you why God forms the most important promises in silence, what happens neurologically when you prematurely expose what is still in process, how Joseph destroyed the trajectory of his own promise by not understanding this dynamic, and what Mary did differently that every bearer of a promise needs to learn. And at the end, I will give you a practical and precise criterion to know what to keep, what to share, with whom, and when. Stay with me. Because what you are about to hear may be the explanation for something that happened in your life that you were never able to understand. There is a phenomenon documented by social psychology that most people have never heard of, which explains with surgical precision why so many dreams die shortly after being verbalized. Researcher Peter Gollwitzer of New York University conducted a series of experiments that produced counterintuitive and disturbing results for anyone who believes that declaring goals out loud increases commitment to them. What Gollwitzer's experiments showed was this: when you verbalize an intention or a goal to another person, and that person acknowledges what you said with any form of validation, a positive response, a nod, an expression of being impressed, your brain registers this social validation as a form of partial goal achievement.
Attention, you need to prepare now. I put together an exclusive resource for those who feel set apart for something greater, but live surrounded by noise, distractions, and mental overload. This is a 30-day journey that will transform your life, a guided path to armor your mind and prepare for what's coming, with daily practices of focus, boundaries, and discipline. Stop negotiating with the noise. Learn to spot distractions before they control you and strengthen your mind. Also available in an immersive audio version. Over 10,000 readers have already transformed their lives through the 30-day journey. Thousands of people have already started this transformation. People like you who were tired of living in the fog, ordinary people who decided to stop accepting mental chaos. Take advantage of this limited time offer only this month. Access your link just below in the pinned comment.
External confirmation activates the same neural reward circuits that would be activated by the actual fulfillment of the goal. And the practical result is that the internal motivation to continue toward the goal decreases, because the brain received a dose of the reward without having done the corresponding work. In other terms, you tell the dream, the person reacts with admiration or enthusiasm, and your brain understands that something has already been conquered. The urgency to do decreases. The impetus to act weakens. The fire that should have been fuel for the journey was consumed in conversation before the journey began. This is not a weakness of character. It is neurology, and it is exactly what the Bible describes with a precision that leaves unanswered any argument that Scripture does not understand human nature. Researchers at the Institute of Psychology at Unicamp, who study identity formation processes in adults, have identified a parallel phenomenon they call premature identity crystallization, when a person defines and publicly declares who they are becoming before the internal process of transformation is consolidated enough to withstand external scrutiny. The result is that the declared identity is exposed to questioning, comparisons, and expectations before having roots deep enough to resist them. And the person, instead of continuing the formation process, begins to defend the declaration. which is a completely different and much less productive movement. You are being formed for something, and what is being formed in you now needs protection, not because it is fragile forever, but because every promise has a phase of vulnerability, a period in which it does not yet have enough structure to withstand public exposure without being deformed by it. If you are watching this content for the first time and it is touching something real in your life, subscribe to the channel now. What we do here every week is exactly that, opening the Bible with honesty, connecting it with what science confirms, and bringing it back to practical life, to real decisions, to the concrete situations you face. Click the red subscription button and activate the bell now. Then continue with me. No biblical story illustrates the cost of premature exposure more clearly than that of Joseph. And I need you to pay attention to this narrative carefully, because conventional readings often present it in a way that misses the most important detail. Joseph receives two dreams. The first, the brothers sheaves bow before his. The second, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars prostrate themselves before him. These dreams are real. The Bible leaves no doubt about this. They are literally fulfilled decades later in Egypt. The promise was true. The problem was not the content of what Joseph received. The problem was what Joseph did with it before the time. He told it, immediately, in detail. To the brothers who already had enough reasons for resentment. To the father he loved, but who was embedded in a family structure of rivalries that Joseph did not yet have enough maturity to navigate with wisdom. And the text of Genesis records the response with a brutal narrative economy. His brothers hated him even more. The promise was legitimate. The exposure was premature. And the result was that Joseph began the fulfillment of the promise not from a position of strength and formation, but from a pit. The longest narrative of formation in the entire book of Genesis, 13 years as a slave, a prisoner, a forgotten man, begins exactly at the moment Joseph confuses having received a promise with having the maturity to carry it in public. This is not a moral judgment on Joseph. It is a description of a law of formation that applies to any bearer of a promise. The size of what you are called to carry determines the size of the formation process necessary before you can do it without destroying yourself along the way. The pit was not Joseph's failure. It was the beginning of the process that premature exposure had made necessary. And the 13 years that followed were not punishment. They were the construction of the person Pharaoh would need to find when the Kairos arrived. Now I want to place alongside Joseph's story a contrast that is rarely made, and which contains the key to everything we are discussing. Luke 1 and 2 record one of the most extraordinary promises in all of Scripture. Mary receives from the angel Gabriel the announcement that she will conceive the Son of God, a promise without historical precedent, without theological parallel, without any reference structure available for her to process what she just received. And Mary's response, after a single genuine question of discernment, "How will this be?" is one of the purest declarations of surrender in the Bible. Let it be to me according to your word. And then Luke records something that most readings pass over quickly. Mary went with haste to find Elizabeth. She went to share, but with whom? With Elizabeth, the only person in her world who was also carrying an impossible promise, who was also in the middle of a supernatural process that most people around her could not understand. Not with the neighbors, not with her friends. With the person who had the experience and discernment to receive what Mary was carrying without deforming it, without questioning with destructive incredulity, without placing the weight of external expectations on a process still in formation. And when Mary returned from Elizabeth's house, Luke records what has become one of the most meaningful texts in the entire Gospel. Mary kept all these things, pondering them in her heart. The Greek word used for kept here is synterio, syntereo. It is not simply remembering. It is to conserve with active care, to protect from deterioration, to preserve the integrity of something precious over time. It is the word you would use to describe how one keeps something that has value and that needs to arrive intact at its destination. Mary did not remain silent out of fear. She did not remain silent out of shame. She remained silent because she had enough wisdom to recognize that what was being formed within her was not yet for public consumption. That the process of gestation, both biological and spiritual, requires protection before exposure. Go to the comments now and write Synterio, just that word, Synterio. Because when you write that, you are declaring, I recognize that keeping with active care is not hiding out of fear. It is protecting what is being formed until it has enough structure to be exposed. Write Synterio now. But here is the distinction that is absolutely crucial, and that I need to deliver with maximum clarity, because its absence is where this message can be distorted in a way that produces real harm. There is a fundamental difference between silence as a vessel of formation and secrecy as a mechanism of isolation, and confusing the two is dangerous. Formative silence is a deliberate and temporary choice about what you share with whom and when. It is selective, not absolute. It protects the process of formation without cutting you off from the relationships of discernment and accountability that are essentially necessary so that you are not deceived during a season of heightened vulnerability. Isolating secrecy, on the other hand, cuts you off from the people who could offer a healthy perspective on what you are receiving and believing. It creates a bubble of private experience where anything can grow without the test of collective discernment. And it is often produced not by wisdom, but by fear that what you believe would not survive the scrutiny of people who know and love you. The Bible has a very clear criterion regarding this. In Proverbs 11:14, the instruction is direct. In the multitude of counselors, there is safety, not in private and isolated spiritual experience, in the multitude of counselors. And in Hebrews 10:25, the exhortation is equally explicit. Do not forsake our gathering, as is the custom of some. Biblical spiritual life is always communal in its fundamental structure, even when certain aspects of it need temporary protection. Mary kept the promise in her heart, but she also went to Elizabeth. She also lived embedded in the faith community of Israel. She also presented Jesus in the temple and received the word from Simeon, which was a public confirmation, pronounced within a communal context of worship. Mary's silence was never absolute. It was selective, temporary, and strategic. Joseph should have kept the dreams, but not forever and not from everyone. He should have sought a Moses, someone with enough wisdom and discernment to receive what he had received without deforming the process. The problem was not having dreamed. It was having told the wrong people at the wrong time without enough maturity to evaluate the impact. Researchers in the field of pastoral psychology at PUCSP, who study spiritual development in adults, have identified that periods of intentional silence regarding spiritual experiences in formation produce significantly positive effects when combined with a relationship of quality mentoring or spiritual accompaniment. In other terms, silence toward the general world, combined with openness to a companion of discernment, is the most effective model of protection documented both spiritually and psychologically. Absolute silence without any relationship of accountability is associated with greater vulnerability to self-deception and distortion of spiritual perception. This is exactly what the biblical tradition teaches, and it is the direct opposite of any instruction that tells you to keep secrets from everyone, including the people who love and know you, because they might disperse what you are receiving. This latter version is not protection, it is isolation. And isolation during a season of heightened spiritual vulnerability is a state of risk, not a state of privilege. If this content is producing clarity about something you have lived or are living, click the like button now. Because when you like the video, you help this content reach people who may be in a state of spiritual isolation that they are interpreting as divine protection and who need to hear this distinction urgently. Click the like button now. Now I need to talk to you about the hiddenness of Jesus, because it is the most complete model of formative silence in all of Scripture, and what it reveals about the process of formation before manifestation will completely change the way you see the seasons in which nothing seems to be happening in your life. Luke 2:52 is one of the most implication-dense verses in the entire New Testament, and also one of the most briefly read. It describes 30 years of Jesus' life in a single sentence, and Jesus grew in wisdom, in stature, and in favor with God and men. 30 years, in almost complete public silence. The Son of God, who at 12 years old already demonstrated an understanding that left the masters of the temple astonished, spent 3 decades in Nazareth, working as a carpenter, living within the structure of family and community. without any public manifestation of the power he carried, without speeches, without miracles, without the public construction of the identity that the mission would demand. And the text says that he grew. Not that he was waiting to grow, not that growth was suspended while the mission had not begun. He grew, continually, progressively, in all the dimensions that the mission would demand. The hiddenness of Jesus was not an absence of formation. It was the space where formation happened, without the deforming pressure of premature exposure. Because if Jesus had initiated his public ministry at 20, before Gethsemane, before the desert, before the 30 years of formation in silence, he would not be the same Jesus who endured the cross without opening his mouth in self-defense, who loved the disciples to the end, who said, "Father, forgive them," in the face of the most unjust suffering in human history. The depth of the manifestation was proportional to the depth of the formation, and the formation required silence. What is being formed in you now, the promise you feel, the dream that does not die, the direction that keeps returning even when you try to discard it, also has a formation process proportional to what will be required of you when the manifestation arrives. And the question I want you to take away is not, when will this manifest, but what is being formed in me during this period in which nothing seems to happen on the outside? Researchers at the Institute of Neurosciences at UFRJ, who study the processes of memory consolidation and deep learning, have identified that periods of apparent inactivity after an intense learning experience are functionally essential for the consolidation of what was learned. The brain continues processing during silence, integrating, connecting, solidifying. Interrupting this process of silence with new stimulation before consolidation is complete fragments the learning and reduces the depth of retention. Silence is not a pause in the process, it is an active phase of it. The same applies to spiritual formation. The 30 years in Nazareth were not a pause before the ministry. They were the ministry in another phase, the phase that made possible everything that would come after. Activate the notification bell now. In the next video, I will go into a question that is directly linked to what we discussed today, to the episode on Kairos, and to the episode on acting within fear. What happens to your relationships when you begin to advance in this season? Why certain people move away? Why this distancing is not rejection, is not abandonment, and is not a sign that you missed the direction. There is a biblical and psychological distinction between isolation and separation that completely changes how you read what is happening around you when you begin to move with purpose. Activate the bell now so you don't miss it. Now I will give you 3 practical criteria to know what to keep, what to share with whom and when. Because formative silence without criteria can become isolation, and sharing without discernment can waste what was still in process. You need both sides of this equation. The first criterion is the maturity of the process. Before sharing what you are receiving, ask a simple question. Does what I am about to reveal already have enough roots to withstand questioning? A buried seed cannot tolerate being dug up for verification. But a tree with established roots can be examined, pruned, and even criticized without losing its structure. The question is not whether what you received is real. It is whether the internal process of formation has reached a point where exposure will strengthen it instead of fragmenting it. Researchers at Endeavor Brazil, who study the development of early-stage entrepreneurs, have documented that projects shared prematurely, before any minimum market validation or basic structure, have a significantly higher abandonment rate than projects developed in silence until an initial proof point. Not because external feedback is destructive in itself, but because the identity of the project is not yet consolidated enough to absorb feedback without collapsing. The criterion of process maturity applies to businesses, to vocations, and to spiritual promises in the same way. The second criterion is the quality of the receiver. Mary did not go to share with just anyone. She went to Elizabeth, someone who was in the same type of process, who had enough spiritual wisdom to receive what Mary carried, who had no competitive interest in what Mary had received, and who was in a position of genuine faith that made her capable of confirming and strengthening instead of questioning and diminishing. Before revealing what is being formed in you, make this evaluation of the person with whom you are considering sharing. Do they have the maturity to receive this without projecting their own fears and limitations onto what I am carrying? Do they have genuine spiritual discernment, not just good intentions? Do they have a genuine interest in my growth, or is there any dynamic of rivalry or dependency that could distort how they receive what I will share? Are they in a position of faith that enables them to speak about this with credibility? It is not arrogance to make this evaluation. It is wisdom, and the absence of it is what leads good people to share real promises with the wrong receivers and interpret the inadequate response as proof that the promise was not real. The third criterion is the motive for the silence, and this is the most important of the three, because it is where the distinction between formative silence and destructive isolation is most clearly revealed. Ask yourself, am I keeping this because the process is still in formation and exposure would fragment what is being built? Or am I keeping it because I am afraid of what people will think, because I don't want to be held accountable if it doesn't happen, because the promise would not survive the scrutiny of those who truly know me? The first motive is process protection. It is synterio, conserving with active care until the right moment. The second motive is fear, and fear is rarely a good guide for decisions about when to speak and when to be silent. The practical difference between the two is this: formative silence is comfortable with the idea that, at the right moment, what you carry will be revealed and will be able to be examined. It has no anxiety about future exposure, only about premature exposure. Secrecy motivated by fear has chronic anxiety about the possibility of exposure at any moment, because deep down, there is the suspicion that what you are keeping would not survive the test. Is there someone in your life who you know is confusing these two things? Who is isolating themselves spiritually and calling it divine protection? Or who is prematurely sharing what is still in process and then blaming people for the energy that vanished? Send this video to that person now, because sometimes the clarity someone needs to protect what is being formed arrives through your hands. Share this video. Before closing, I need to say something that is non-negotiable and that defines everything we talked about today. Formative silence is never an instrument of total isolation from relationships of accountability and pastoral care. Any teaching that instructs you to keep secrets from the people who love you, who advise you, and who have pastoral and relational authority in your life, especially during a season of intense spiritual experience, is not protecting your process. It is making you vulnerable to self-deception. The biblical tradition of spiritual discernment is consistently communal. The prophets had schools of prophets. Paul had Barnabas, Silas, Timothy. John the Baptist had disciples. Jesus had the 12. Spiritual experience that does not tolerate any form of community of discernment is not a sign of special election. It is a sign of increased risk. What you keep and how you keep it matters, but from whom you keep it also matters. And the biblical answer is never from everyone, including those who have wisdom and genuine love to accompany what you are living. You have reached the end, and what I want you to take away is very practical. There is something being formed in you now, a direction, a promise, a dream that keeps returning, and in the face of that, you are probably in one of two opposite errors: exposing too much before the time to the wrong people, or keeping it in total isolation, without any companion of discernment who can help distinguish what is genuine formation from what is self-desire dressed in spiritual language. Both errors have the same result. What was being formed does not arrive at its destination intact. The biblical model is a third way. Mary, synterio in the heart, but Elizabeth in the process. Jesus, 30 years of hiddenness, but embedded in the community, in the family, in the synagogue, in the temple. Joseph, he should have kept the dreams, but not to isolate himself, to mature until he had the wisdom necessary to carry them in public without the weight crushing them before the time. The promise you carry is real. The formation process it requires is also real. And the protection it needs is not secrecy. It is wisdom about the time, the receiver, and the motive of what you keep and what you reveal. Synterio, keep with active care, not out of fear, out of wisdom. In the next video, what happens in your relationships when you advance within your purpose? Why the distancing of certain people is not rejection? Why the loneliness you feel in certain seasons is not abandonment? And what is the difference between isolation and separation that will change the way you read everything that is happening around you now. Until then.
Attention, you need to prepare now. I put together an exclusive resource for those who feel set apart for something greater, but live surrounded by noise, distractions, and mental overload. This is a 30-day journey that will transform your life, a guided path to armor your mind and prepare for what's coming, with daily practices of focus, boundaries, and discipline. Stop negotiating with the noise. Learn to spot distractions before they control you and strengthen your mind. Also available in an immersive audio version. Over 10,000 readers have already transformed their lives through the 30-day journey. Thousands of people have already started this transformation. People like you who were tired of living in the fog, ordinary people who decided to stop accepting mental chaos. Take advantage of this limited time offer only this month. Access your link just below in the pinned comment.